Hi everyone, welcome to Sew Against the Grain and happy National Sewing Month. National Sewing Month is kind of an unofficial holiday for the month of September in the United States, and part of the charge during National Sewing Month is to encourage and support people who are new to sewing or have never sewed before to try out the hobby and try out the craft. Part of how I would like to celebrate National Sewing Month is by putting together a sew-along for the Butterick 65-63 blouse, which I've made several times, and there's a couple of tricky parts on it when it comes to the facing and the collar, and I've had a couple of questions on social media about it, so I figured first National Sewing Month, and then to also answer some of those questions, I would do a video where I construct the blouse from beginning to end. So that's what you're going to see next in this video. I hope you really enjoy it, and please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks. All right, y'all, let's get started. So I'm going to be referring to the pattern instructions as we go through the sew along, but there's a couple of steps that are not listed in the pattern instructions that I'm going to mention, and we're going to do it in a little bit of a different order. So the instructions have you start with applying all of the interfacing and actually sewing the darts, and the pocket is next, but we're going to start by stay stitching the neckline. We're going to start by stay stitching the neckline on the front and back bodice pattern pieces. So here is my bodice front, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to stay stitch. This is the neckline up here. I'm going to start in the outside corner and come down to the center. This is the self-facing. I'm going to start on the outside corner and come down to the center and do this on both front pieces. Okay, so we have done our stay stitching. So here's one of the fronts with the stay stitching. Here's the other front with the stay stitching at the neckline. And then I also stay stitched the back neckline as well. So now we're ready for step number 2 on the instructions, which is to do the bust dart. And then it also has a waist dart, but I have changed mine to a tuck instead. So you can see on my piece where I've marked my lines, I have a bust dart up here, and instead of doing a waist dart, I'm actually just going to do a straight tuck. It's easier to sew, and I also like the look of it, so I've changed my pattern to do this. If you want to do something similar, what's been a good fit for me is to lower the apex of what was the dart about 2 inches, draw 2 straight lines to connect the dot that's 2 inches below the bust dart through the side of the dart lines, and then all the way to the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and sew the dart and the tuck on both front pieces, and then I'll be back to show you the next step. Okay, I have sewn and pressed my waist tuck and my bust dart, so now we're ready for the next step. Step 3 is to finish the upper edge of the pocket. And I went ahead and did some machine embroidery on my pocket, so it's got some bats on it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run the upper edge through my serger, and then I'm going to fold it down along the fold line and go ahead and sew the sides so that I can get ready to attach the pocket, and I will be right back with the next step. Okay, so I serged the very top edge of my pocket. I folded the top down on itself, right sides together, and then I sewed 5/8 of an inch along the edges, and I just trimmed the corner so it's a little bit easier to turn out. But what I'm going to do now, I'm going to turn it out, I'm going to take it to my iron, and I'm going to press down a 5/8 seam allowance all along the sides, along the bottom, give it a good press. This extra white paper here is some cutaway stabilizer from the embroidery, so that's going to actually stay inside the pocket, but I never put anything in these pockets, so I can't imagine it's going to get in the way, but that's what this is. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the iron, give this a good press, and then we'll move on to the next step. Dasha's here to help, as you can see, laying on the instructions and getting in the way. as she does. So I have my pocket pressed. So I folded it all in, turned it right side out, poked out my corners, and this will be ready to apply to the front of the blouse when we get to that step. Excuse me, Dasha. Excuse me. So we just completed instruction number 3, which was to fold down the top of the pocket, and instruction number 4, which was to turn in the inner edges. So now we are ready to go ahead and pin the pocket on the left front and edge stitch it on. Here's my left front pattern piece, and I have 2 marks, which are probably not super visible on the video, but I have 2 marks for my pocket placement. And I do want to mention that I have made the pocket pattern piece larger for my top. I don't think the tiny pocket on a large bust doesn't look great to me, so I enlarged my pocket by about 1/2 inch all around. So you'll see that my pocket placement doesn't really match. I'm about 1/2 inch off on both sides, but that's because I made it bigger. I still use the same placement to place the top of my pocket, and I'll just kind of arrange it flat. I'm going to take it over to my sewing machine. I'm going to top stitch this on, and then we're ready for the next step. Alright, so here is step number 5 done. We've edge stitched our pocket to the front of the blouse. Next is going to be step number 6, which says to ease stitch the shoulders of the back. And actually every time I've sewn this pattern, there's not any extra ease in the back, so I'm not sure if there's intended to be ease or the particular size that I made doesn't have any, but I actually skip step 6 altogether. There's no need to edge stitch. If the pattern that you're making, if the size that you're making needs to edge stitch, feel free to do that, but I'm going to skip step 6 altogether and move on to step 7, which is to pin the fronts to the backs and to go ahead and sew them together. So I'm going to go ahead and sew the 2 front pieces to the back piece at the shoulders, and I will be back for the next step. Okay, so I sewed the shoulders together of my blouse. So this is the back and these are the 2 fronts. And I went ahead and serged them together and pressed them towards the front. And you want to make sure that your seam allowance is pressed towards the front, or at least half of it is pressed towards the front if you finish them separately, because we're going to need to hand stitch the facing to this later, and we're going to want to have that extra fabric towards the front so we can hand stitch it together. So we just completed step number 7. So now we're ready for step number 8, which is the collar. So the first part of the collar instructions say to stay stitch the entire neck of the top, which we've already done in the very beginning to prevent it from stretching out of shape or doing anything weird. So we can go ahead and skip that. We already did it, which is really exciting. So I do step number 9 and step number 10 at the same time. So step number 9 tells us to reinforce the edge of the collar through the triangles, and then to clip. And I haven't clipped yet, but this is what it looks like. So I make a little mark where the triangles are, and I just sew some reinforcement stitches about 5/8 in from where the triangles. And then we fold the collar in half for step number 10, and we sew right sides together on the short ends, which I've already done. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to trim the corners off and pink both sides of the collar short ends, so that it lays a little bit flatter, and then I'm going to clip where the triangles are marked to the reinforcement stitching line that I just did, and then I'll come back for the next step. Okay, I have turned my collar right side out and I've given it a good press, and then I've also tucked in a 5/8 seam allowance right where the reinforcement stitches are to go ahead and attach the collar. So we are ready for the next step, which is step 11, to baste the raw edges together. And so for step 11, we're only basting on this full length piece here. We don't need to baste in the middle. So I'm going to go ahead and baste that, and I'll be back for the next step. Okay, collar is basted, and we are ready for step number 12. So step number 12 is to pin the collar to the neck edge with right sides together, matching notches, center backs, triangle circles, clipping top, neck edge where necessary, and base, keeping the pressed under edge free. So here is my bodice. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start pinning my collar to my bodice right sides together. So I'm gonna go ahead and pin this and show you what it should look like before I sew it, and then I'll come back and give you an idea of what it should look like. Okay, so I have my collar pinned to the blouse, and I'm gonna kind of move this around to show you what I have here. So this is the top side of the collar. Here's the bottom side that's gonna actually face the bodice. Here is the front of the bodice, the back of the bodice, and then the other front of the bodice. So I have it right sides together, and you want to make sure that your kind of folded over piece of the collar is facing up when you sew this. And you are going to need to probably notch your neckline as you get ready to put the collar in to give you a little bit of extra room to match up the straight edge of the collar with the curve of the actual neckline. So I have my notches matched. I have everything kind of clipped to fit. I'm going to make sure that I only stitch on the exposed inside part of the collar and not this folded over edge when I sew this seam. And I'll be right back for the next step. Okay, so I went ahead and I finished step number 12, which is to pin the collar to the neck edge, right sides together, and to go ahead and baste it, keeping the pressed edge end free. So we are not doing view C, so I'm going to skip instruction 13, 14, 15, instruction number 16 we're skipping, and now we're going to go to instruction number 17. So we're going to turn the front self-facings to outside along fold lines and pin the self-facings to neck edge, clipping self-facings when necessary, stitch, keeping pressed under edge of collar free. So this is the step that I think is confusing for people who are making this blouse, and it was definitely confusing for me the first time I made it. What the instructions are asking you to do is I'm going to go ahead and turn my blouse so that I'm looking at the right side of it. You want to find where your collar ends on the front of the blouse, and so we have notches here. So here's the notch on the collar, and then I have a notch on the facing. We want to take the facing, so here's my inner facing. So this is the right side of the facing. So I want to take my facing and I want to fold it down so that the right side of the facing is facing the right side of the collar. So this is a little unusual, but it's going to work out perfectly. So now I'm going to match my notch to my notch. I'm probably going to need to do a little bit of clipping, and I'm going to go ahead and pin this, and I'll do it one more time and show you how to do the other side as well. So I'll be right back. Alright, so I sewed one side of the facing so that you can see what it looks like once it's sewed. So this will actually flip around, and then magically we'll have a beautiful collar ready to go. But this is what it looks like after you stitch it. And I'm just going to show you one more time how to flip the facing onto the rest of the blouse so that you can sew it together. So here I have the right side of my blouse. Here's the right side of the self-facing. You're going to fold it in on itself, right sides together with the front of the blouse. I'm going to find my notch on the blouse. Go ahead and start pinning, pinning, pinning all the way to the end and all the way to the other end of the facing, and go ahead and stitch that together, clipping where necessary. I did also serge the very top of my facing. So if you use a different method other than serging to finish your seam, that's perfect. But make sure you leave as much fabric as you possibly can at the very short end of the facing at the top, because you're going to hand stitch that later, and it's helpful to just have more fabric there as much as you possibly can. And then I also finish the long edge of both sides of my self-facing so that they are ready to go once I flip them out. But I am going to finish pinning this, clip it, sew it, and then I will come back and show you how to finish up the collar portion of the blouse. Okay, so I have gone ahead and sewed together the self-facing, the collar, and the blouse. So this is what it looks like. I went ahead and pinked where the self-facing is and trimmed the corners on both sides, but I left the neckline edge whole. So what will happen now, I'm going to go give this a good press, I need to trim some threads too, is you go ahead and turn the self-facing to the inside, and I'll poke out the corners and trim everything and press it so it looks nice. But this is what we have now when we look at the inside of the blouse. So we have 2 self-facings on both sides. We have a collar. What will happen now is I'll go ahead and give everything a good press, trim anything that needs to be trimmed as far as threads or anything that's stray. But this is what your collar should look like once you attach it to the blouse and sew the self-facing. So let me give this an iron. I'll come back and we'll move on to the next step. Okay, I went ahead and ironed the facings down and we're ready for the next step. So we did step number 17. So step number 18 is to clip the neck seam allowance at ends of self-facings as shown and to trim seam allowances. So this is also a little bit confusing, but this is what it wants you to do. So we have our self-facing, which I have here on top, and our collar and our blouse. We need to be able to fold all of this seam allowance from the collar up inside the collar. And the thing that's preventing us from doing that is that we have this seam allowance here. This is the shoulder of the blouse, the facing, and the collar. We have this seam allowance that needs to be trimmed. So I have a pair of scissors and I'm going to show you exactly where to snip it. So you can see the end of our facing comes right to the shoulder line. So if we open up our facing and look at the seam allowance that we have here, we want to trim right next to the seam allowance of the facing inside the blouse. We're just cutting the collar and the back of the blouse. So the seam that we have open, we're going to cut up to our seam line and nothing else. So now when I lay this down flat, you can see that I can push the seam allowance up into the collar. So this is what it should look like. So now what will happen is I'm going to clip it on the other side, and we're going to hand stitch the collar down to the seam allowance along the back of the blouse, and we're also going to hand stitch the end of the facing, the self-facing, to the seam allowance for the shoulder. So I'm going to go ahead and trim the other one to show you how to do it one more time. So here's my self-facing, here's my collar, here's my seam allowance, back of my blouse. I'm going to take my scissors, open up the facing, I'm going to snip just the seam allowance up into the stitch line right next to the end of the facing. So now I can push this seam allowance up into my collar, fold it down, we have a beautiful finished edge, and I'm going to go ahead and hand sew this and then hand sew each end of my facing to the shoulder seam so everything is contained. I'm going to go ahead and do that and I'll come back and show you the next step. Alright, so here we are with step number 19 done. We've turned our self-facings to the inside, pressed the seam allowance. I went ahead and hand stitched the facing to the shoulder seam. I hand stitched the collar down. Here's the other facing hand stitched. With any luck, there's no visible stitching on the collar or self-facings on the outside of your blouse. And if there is, that's okay. Sewing should be fun. No one's going to see it because your collar is going to be flipped down over it. But this is where we are. The bulk of the blouse is really kind of done now. That was the only tricky part of this one. But we'll go ahead and finish it up. So the next step is step number 20, which is to stitch the back to the front at sides. And I think it's a little unusual that this step is so late in the construction of the blouse. So if you want to do the side stitches when you do if you want to do the side seams when you do the shoulder seams, you can definitely do that. It shouldn't make any difference whatsoever. A lot of times I do the side seams and the shoulder seams at the same time. That way I can serge them and press them all in one step, but the instructions have us do it now, so I went ahead and waited so I can make sure I'm following the instructions as closely as possible for the video. But I'm going to go ahead and stitch the side front to the side back together on both sides. I'm going to finish it and I'm going to press it and I'll come back for the next step. Okay, I have stitched, finished, and pressed the side seams of both sides of my blouse. And if I lay it out like this, you can see it looks like a blouse, which is super exciting. So the pieces that we have left, we need to go ahead and assemble and set the sleeves. We're going to need to hem it, and then we're going to need to do buttonholes and buttons, but other than that, you have the basics of the blouse ready to go. So I am putting sleeves on mine, so I'm going to skip instruction number 21, 22, 23, and 24, which are for the armhole facing, since I won't be using that. So we are making sleeve C, and it's super straightforward, so I skipped ahead a couple of steps, but step 33 is that we want to gather the top of the sleeve between the small circles. So I have both of my sleeves here with a ton of threads hanging off of them, and I have basting stitches, 2 rows of basting stitches, one inside the seam allowance and one outside the seam allowance at both of the sleeve caps of the sleeves. I've gone ahead and sewed them together and finished the edges and pressed them towards the wrong side, and then I also have 2 rows of basting stitches at the bottom of both of the sleeves. So we've done step 33, which is to gather the upper edge and lower edge of the sleeve. We've done step 34, which is to stitch the sleeve seam. So step 35 is to stitch the ends of the sleeve band together. So I have both of my sleeve bands here, and I've had to modify my sleeve bands to be, I think I added about 4 inches of width to this to fit around my arm, so yours will likely look a little bit smaller than this. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch the sleeve band together, so that's going to be step 35. So I will do that for both of these and then come back. Okay, I have both of my sleeve bands ready to go. So I have done step 35, which is to sew the short ends together. So you can see there, I've done that. I just pinked the edge to reduce some bulk. This is going to be inside, so no one's going to see it, so I don't bother serging it. So I've done that for both. And then for step 36, I do this step a little bit differently than the instructions say. The instruction want us to pin under, to press under 5/8 of an inch on the unnotched edge. I don't bother doing that. I actually press it in half instead, and this makes it really easy to turn up when we get to the point that we're ready to do so. But I'm going to go ahead and stitch both of these to my sleeves, and I'll come back and show you how to turn them up. Alright, so hem bands on the sleeves are sewn on, so let me give you an idea of what this looks like. So we have the sleeve, we have the band, and then what's going to happen is I'm going to take my pinking shears and just trim this seam here. Hi, Tasha. Trim this seam here to get rid of the bulk, but when I'm ready to, I'm going to go ahead and turn this down, and this is where ironing it in half is really helpful. So I'm going to fold it in half with all of the seam allowance inside. It'll look like this from the outside, and then on the inside I just tuck this open part of the band down. I'm going to line it up with my line of stitching from attaching the band to the sleeve, and I like to go ahead and top stitch both the top and the bottom of the hem band on the sleeve. You could definitely slip stitch it by hand or attach it in some other way, but I actually really like the look of it being top stitched, so that is what I'm going to go ahead and do. So I'm going to finish the sleeve hem band, and then I will come back for the next step. Alright, both sleeves are done. There's the sleeve hem band. They are top stitched. I gave them a good press, and they are ready to be inserted into the blouse. So let's see, we just finished step 38, which is to turn the band to the inside along fold line. You can slip stitch it. Like I said, I top stitched it, and now we're on to page 30, instruction number 39, where we're going to go ahead and insert the sleeve. And these are really easy to insert since they're intended to be gathered. You don't need to worry about the sleeve having any gathers in it since it's supposed to be like that. Just make sure there's no puckers in the actual blouse. But I'm going to go ahead and insert both of these sleeves, remove the gathering stitches that are visible, finish that seam, and then we'll come back and do the finishing steps. Alright, both sleeves are in. I have finished the seam inside by serging it. I pressed them and I took out the basting stitches. So we are in the home stretch. So we just finished instruction number 39. So instruction number 40 is to hem it. So turn lower edge of self-facings outside along fold line, stitch 5/8 above raw edge, trim as shown. So I have my self-facings pressed along the line that they are going to be turned out at. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn them back on themselves so they're right sides together. I'm going to go ahead and pinch this. I'm going to pin these two pieces together. I'm going to sew 5/8 of an inch only along where the facing is, and I'm going to do this on both sides. Okay, I turned the facings right sides together with the blouse. I stitched 5/8 and I actually serged the entire hem of the blouse, so I'm ready to finish it up. So now you just turn your facing back to the inside. It automatically kind of helps you fold up the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to turn up the whole 5/8 along the hem, stitch it, press it, and then I'll be back. All right, last couple of instructions for this pattern. So 41 is to just go ahead and sew the hem, which I just did. You can see here's my facing. I'm going to trim the serger thread. You can see it actually through the fabric. I have my hem here all along the bottom. I usually on blouses just top stitch hems. If you want to do something that doesn't have visible stitching on the outside, feel free. I almost always tuck my blouses in, so I don't worry about doing anything other than top stitching, but you can definitely do something different. So that was step 41. Step 42 and 43 are the buttons and buttonholes. So I'm not going to do that as part of this tutorial, but I am going to finish this up with buttonholes and then put some buttons on it. I did want to show you all the buttons that I made to go on this. So they have kind of this orangey red glitter in the square part of the button, and then it's a black on the round part that serves as the background for the button. So I'm pretty excited for these. I think they'll be a really good match with the black from the bat and then also the orange from the blouse. It's just kind of a neat look. I've used this particular button on a different version of this exact same blouse, and I really like them. They're just the perfect size. They look really vintage, having the square and the circle shapes in them, so I really like these. So I'm going to go ahead and put the buttonholes in this. I'm going to attach the buttons, and that is it for the sew along for the Butterick blouse. I hope you enjoyed this and that it was helpful, especially the collar facing part of it, which I know can be confusing. If you have any questions, definitely let me know. Well, that's it for the sew along. How did your blouse turn out? I'd love to see pictures of it if you post it on Instagram and tag me, or let me know in the comments if you have any questions or thoughts about the pattern. I hope you really enjoyed putting it together, or at least watching me put it together, and I look forward to seeing everybody's Butterick 65, 63 blouses moving forward. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.